Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. The topics discussed in this podcast will reflect my opinions and are not in any way to be regarded as medical advice. Australia and New Zealand sometimes can be a little bit analogised to the United States and Canada in as much as they have similar but different cultures, and one is sort of like the baby brother of the other in terms of population. New Zealand is getting it right in terms of having a royal commission into the COVID pandemic response. Winston Peters, their current Deputy Prime Minister, recently visited Australia and quite correctly said that the inquiry that Australia is doing is, this is not exactly his words, but pathetic, because it doesn't have the powers of a royal commission. Notwithstanding that, I'm going to give some credit to the authors of the 868-page report, and you can find it online. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you read it all. I haven't. But there are some highlights, and we'll put links to the Australian newspaper, which has reported on this particularly well. Australia's pandemic response fixated on case numbers and lost sight of the broader mental health impacts of lockdowns and school closures. The authors said the effect would be likely not fully known for some time, and the government urged to invest more in mental health support for children and young people as a priority. So that's just going to be throwing money after a problem that was artificially created by government actions. Quote, increased social isolation, stress, anxiety, uncertainty, loss of control, disruption to daily routines, and concerns for well-being of family and loved ones created the conditions for either the onset of ill health, or deterioration of existing conditions, the authors said. School closures and remote learning also led to increased engagement with social media, triggering weight and body-checking behaviours amongst young people. The experts said research had also suggested that lockdown-induced lifestyle disruption caused changes in brain biology in children and young people with a greater impact on females. So this is unprecedented. And if there are changes in brain biology, this could play out for the rest of these people's lives. It's just, and people will say, well, we didn't know at the time. It was pretty evident by the middle of 2020 that we were not all in this together. This virus, like influenza, like pretty much all viruses, disproportionately affects certain groups. And those groups are particularly the elderly and those already with established major medical problems. Now, we're not going to throw these people to the wolves. It's like, don't we care about Granny? Yeah, we do care about Granny. Like, we care about her with the flu, and we care about her each winter. We don't go and visit her when we're sick. And, we do our best to protect her. But that's quite different to doing that at the expense of the health of young generations. Typically, throughout human history, there's been a greater emphasis on protection of the young because they are the future. They've got more life years in front of them than somebody who's in their 80s or 90s. And I really want to emphasise, this is not to say we don't do our best for those people, but do we do it by sacrificing younger people's health? And that's what we've done. And that, I think, is unforgivable. All right, are we going to do better next time? Well, look, hopefully there won't be a next time, but I suspect we will do, but more by the fact that people won't wear what was done this time. The amount of efforts that were gone to suppress the origin of the virus, which did come from a lab, there's no question about it. It didn't come from a bat or a pangolin or some wet market. It was a laboratory with perhaps questionable biosecurity. Again, I can't make absolute comment, but it makes sense. And it escaped from there. And the efforts that people like Fauci went to cover that up are quite extraordinary. And hopefully there'll be a day of reckoning. And I suspect with the RFKJ becoming health secretary that he will hopefully oversee that. There's a big difference between making mistakes because we don't know or acting on the side of caution and knowingly covering something up, and that is certainly what happened, and shutting down questioners such as Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, who was one of the co-authors with Martin Kulldorff of the Great Barrington Declaration, which came out in the second half of 2020 and essentially laid out a framework for focused protection of those who needed it whilst letting everybody else get on with their lives. It was not that difficult. We've done it before. So the Australian inquiry, unfortunately, excluded the actions of state governments. It looked at the federal government. And this is all politics because most of the state governments were Labor. The then federal government was Liberal National, which for those of you in other countries, more like Republican or Conservative. And therefore, in ordering this inquiry, they're looking after their mates. Now, more damage was done, far, far, far more damage was done by state premiers, some of whom have received gongs. It's just appalling, for their services, I don't know to what or to who, than the federal government. Yes, the federal government locked the borders and people weren't allowed to leave Australia, but state premiers were the ones who closed state borders, who stopped people visiting loved ones, attending funerals. One of the famous cases in Queensland where the government would not allow somebody who lived in northern New South Wales who was pregnant to go to a hospital, notwithstanding the Brisbane, the capital of Queensland, is far closer to this person than Sydney, the capital of New South Wales. This is all just crazy stuff. And there's been no consequences for any of the people involved, which is an absolute tragedy. The report, and again I'll quote, said Australians backed lockdowns in the initial stages but felt restrictive measures became increasingly inappropriate and were too heavy-handed. There was a lack of compassion and too few exceptions based on needs and circumstances. Now, the interesting comparison is to look at Florida and California in the United States. Florida opened up almost fully in about September, October 2020. California was still with school closures and masking toddlers. Who on earth puts a mask on a 2-year-old? I mean, seriously. Right through until late 2021. And they have similar populations. Florida's possibly older because a lot of people from northeast United States, New York in particular, retire down to Florida. And yet you look at the outcome and they're about the same. Sweden, who everybody criticised, the Swedes have got it wrong, they're taking their lives into their hands. No. Their data shows that their excess mortality and their numbers pretty much the same as everybody else's, and in fact, amongst the European countries, better. And Sweden is cold. Like, it's much, people get outside much less in Sweden, especially for probably 8 months of the year, than somewhere like Australia, where they were trying to fine you for playing golf outside in the fresh air. Nobody ever got COVID. In fact, you don't normally get any virus out in the fresh air for the obvious reason. Okay, Health Minister Mark Butler declared the report didn't seek to scapegoat people. Well, no, we don't want to scapegoat people, but we need to hold people responsible, and I don't think this report did that, notwithstanding, to be fair to the authors, they really weren't in a position to do so. But to get back to the start, they did identify that the measures, which maybe at the very, very start were justifiable, went on too long and took no account, and it's not as if they weren't being warned this was the case, took no account of adverse effects. There is no intervention in medical practice that is free of adverse events or side effects. And if the side effects or adverse effects outweigh the beneficial effects, then you stop doing what you're doing. Problem is, case numbers can be told in a press conference each morning. Mental health problems that might go on for the next 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years won't all happen at once on one day. There won't be press conferences about it. You won't hear about it. But they'll still happen. The question arises, what can we collectively do to ensure that that measures like were taken in the first part of this decade are never taken again? That is really up to the citizens. Really, if we are, and I don't think we will be, I really don't think we will be, confronted by an issue like this again, then it's absolutely the case that the citizens must hold those in power to account and ensure that we do not have any repeat. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and consider subscribing. Tell your friends. If there are topics you'd like to see covered, be in touch through the chat or email info@drjoe.net.au. We'll be uploading new content each Monday, and soon we'll be putting these videos out on X. You can follow me there at Dr. Joe's DIY Health.